I'm Nick Kolba. I'm a person at OpenFin, and I also head up the FDC3 program within FINOS, and I was the technical co-founder of FDC3. And I want to talk about why I feel so strongly about this topic and of interoperability on the desktop, on the financial desktop specifically, and why I feel so passionately about it that I would spend probably like an insane amount of time in the last year of my life just banging my head against this topic. But as many, many other people in this room have, there you go. So here we go. Interoperability is magical. It's absolutely a magical thing. For those of you who were at FinJS last night, you know this firsthand because for some crazy reason we had this really amazing magician. And the really cool thing, and this is not a good magic trick, but why I think interoperability is especially magical and why I think this is a very apt metaphor is that this is just amazing, right? It just works. And yet, you know, if you really like parse what happens in most magic tricks, it's just like basic sleight of hand, and along with a lot of just kind of, you know, showmanship that makes people forget about that basic sleight of hand. And I feel like a lot of technical interoperability is also like that, where, you know, there's an incredible, like, awe-inspiring thing about things just working, and yet, you know, when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, it's a lot of just like sweat going into making that work. So this is peanut butter. And, you know, peanut butter doesn't know anything about chocolate, right? And yet, you put these two things together, and it's really exciting. So this is, many of you probably weren't around in the 80s in the US, so that's an old ad for Reese's peanut butter cups. And the whole point of it is like the chocolate goes into the peanut butter, it's an accident, but then people discover it actually tastes amazing. For British people, you have toast and you have Marmite. And apparently I've heard that if you put these two things together, it's okay. But yeah. I remember the first time I saw a British friend eating Marmite, and I was astonished. So the thing is, like, somebody's got to spread the Marmite, right? And making the end user the interop layer is horrible UX, right? If we force the end user to be that layer, it's just terrible. And so nobody should ever fly with me. I have a horrible track record with bad luck, and Mazi has made it so that nobody can fly with me in the company. So I was coming out here. I was supposed to be on Virgin Atlantic, and my flight got canceled. It doesn't really matter. I ended up booking something on Norwegian, and then I had to, like, I bought my ticket through Priceline, and I'm talking to Virgin, and they wouldn't change my ticket, and Priceline wouldn't change my ticket either because they both need each other's permission. And I ended up having, in JFK at like 6 in the morning with no sleep, conference call between Priceline and Virgin Atlantic for an hour and a half walking around the airport. It was just a horrible experience. And I realized, I had this epiphany that, oh my God, they have forced me to be the interop layer. I had to like go back and forth between these two support people and get them to talk to each other and get them to exchange information so they could sort out my return ticket, which I'm not even sure if it's sorted still, so I may still be here on Monday. So when you force end users to do this, it's terrible, and when you don't, it's magical. So this brings us to web intents, and a lot of people probably haven't even heard of this thing. So like, we go into the history of web intents. So this was an effort that started in 2010 by Paul Kinlan, who's an amazing guy on the Chromium team at Google, and they tried to create this standard around interoperability on the desktop, really in the browser, that mirrored what they were starting to do in Android around intents. Basically, they produced some demos, but it didn't go anywhere, and by 2012 they pulled the code out of Chrome. Mozilla had made a a similar attempt with this thing called web activities that also is dormant. I think it's still in like Mozilla OS, but really I don't know who uses Mozilla OS. So when we started FDC3, I started thinking about web intents and kind of going back to that. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. And I really wanted to educate myself on like what happened there. You know, I think another important thing just from the slides, think about how different 2010 was, right? Like, and this is kind of startling when you like kind of look back to the history, you're like, wow, in 2010, like only like not even a third of people in the US had smartphones, I think is the stats here. I mean, I don't know all these stats, but there's like 15% of people have posted a photo or a video online, right, via their phone. I mean, this is like, this stuff barely existed, right? So at the time that people were trying to create this, they were looking very, very far into the future. And they were thinking about how the mobile experience was going to evolve and trying to do it on desktop. And this is cool. This is from a demo that Paul Kinlan and Paul Lewis, who are both on the Chromium team, did on September 25th, which is incidentally my son's birthday, in 2012. I'm not going to show you the video. These are just like clips from it. The idea here is that there's this meme generator app that's in one browser tab. And there's a thing where you can click to pick an image. It fires off a web intent, and the browser brings up this dialog and asks you, oh, what app would you like to use to select an image from, right? And these are all web apps, right? They're just running in browser tabs. And then you pick the, whatever, the cloud file picker, and then you get a bunch of images. You select a file. It sends it back to the image generator app. And then you take that and you edit it, and you select an editing tool, and you go to that editing tool, and then you create your meme. Not a very good meme. That's actually Paul Kinlan there. I don't think he usually looks like that, but and then you have your meme created. And that's really amazing when you think about, like, that was all done in a browser, and those three web apps didn't know anything about each other, and they were just following some sort of intent standard to make that happen. I don't know, it makes me really excited to think about the web working that way. And this was done with like 30 lines of code in the application to make that work. So it's like very lightweight in terms of the amount that an application developer would have to do. But it didn't work, right? They weren't able to get it done. And there were a couple other attempts. There was this thing called Web Wishes, which I didn't even know about until I started prepping this talk in 2014. That's just kind of sitting there as a draft standard. Very, very similar stuff. Like, I mean, it looks exactly the same kind of workflow. And for some reason, everybody uses memes for the example. And you can see how dated this is, like Friendster, MySpace, you know. And you're really digging through the archives here. It's archaeology. And then, you know, and then you get a link, et cetera. And this is from 2017. So the last reference I could find from Paul on web intents. He created this thing called Comlink. It's actually a really cool library that is, I think, still active, that basically creates an RPC interface in front of like post-message, on-message, post-message, IPC in Chrome. So for basically trying to like deal with the fact that service workers and shared workers are really cool, but most developers have a really hard time working with them because it's very hard to like create an API on top of that and manage all that. And so it takes care of all that crap for you. You can see he kind of posted as like, I got web intents working again. And then somebody asks him, nice, are the UX problems solved by now? And he says, nope. I'm just working out like RPC. Like UX problems are still there, right? We haven't figured that out. We haven't solved that, right? And so I should have taken this as a warning, but you know, this is an area fraught with peril, obviously, right? It's trying to get the simple magic trick of two unrelated things to just work together is obviously a place of dragons, right? So let's look at why did web intents fail? right? And for all of you involved with FDC3, we should take a sobering look at this, right? So scope. This is all from Paul Kinlan's blog about this. So these are in exactly his words. But it really comes down to, there was an overly broad definition of intents. So basically, they just had a very open-ended notion of intents. Anybody could create their own intent. And so it was very, very broad. And people, they kind of encouraged people to create lots of custom cool intents. And they didn't have very specific use cases, right? And he's looking back, he said, we really needed to have those use cases defined, and we need to have a much smaller pool of well-defined intents to make this work. Because if it's so broad, it just becomes a fragmented space, and your sort of focus and energy is spread out all over the place. Politics, right? And we have them in finance, we have them in FDC3, they certainly have them on the W3C. So as we know, Mozilla had this other competing standard, or standard proposal, and they just couldn't get the two to work together. And they couldn't find consensus with Mozilla. There were a lot of things, like even the name of intents, of web intents, was a sensitive topic because it was a very Android-specific branding. And they chose to follow the Android API very closely, a lot of the terminology, which, obviously other people in the W3C who weren't pushing Android didn't really like. Google also wanted to create a HTML tag for the intent, which turned out to be a very controversial thing. I know, it's like, new HTML tag, why should it be controversial? It's super controversial. If you look at things that happened with the web components debate in W3C, a lot of that had to do with the semantic nature of web. Google, I'm not sure there's anybody from Google in the audience, but so Google, 90% of their revenue is advertising from based on the web being semantic. So they have a clear commercial stake in the web staying semantic, and obviously be very cool for Google if everybody put intent tags in their web apps and Google could index all that stuff, right? So there was a single place where they could go and get all this information. And honestly, I think it would be cool too, but obviously it creates a political dimension to things that can become tricky. And then finally the UX, which was a really critical problem. So I think what it really comes down to is that there was really no orchestrator for the UX. If you're in the mobile space, your phone becomes the orchestrator for the UX when you have interoperability between apps. On the desktop, this doesn't exist, right? You don't have an equivalent thing at least on the consumer desktop. And you're in a browser, you're just locked into independent tabs. So one of the problems, the problem he's referencing here is just that, I go to my image picker, I select, I want to pick an image, it opens up the image picker app, and then I select an image, but then I close the tab for the first app, what happens, right? There's nothing controlling, orchestrating the UX between these apps that are engaged in interop when we're working within the Chrome browser. I think it really boils down to, one does not simply create interoperability on the desktop, right? Sorry, I had to do that. But it's a really difficult thing, right? This is something where Google failed, Mozilla failed, and probably many others that I'm not even aware of have failed at doing this. So anyway, we threw caution to the wind and we created FDC3. Which we did, it was October of 2017. We started, I think it started with a dinner here in London that I wasn't invited to. And then when they wanted to do the real work, they called me up and we had our first meeting in October of 2017. We got together people from about 12 firms. And then that just quickly grew. And we contributed into FINOS. I'm blanking on the date, but we contributed everything into FINOS when FINOS was first formed. And now FDC3 has grown to like 55 plus organizations. There's a lot of participants, and it's a really, what I love about it, it's a super representative group of people working on this. It's not just one or two organizations. There's lots of representation across the whole financial spectrum. We have sell side, buy side, we have vendors, and it's very exciting. To me, at least, it's very exciting. I hope it's exciting to some of you, especially the ones that are participating with me in this. So we wanted to solve this problem of forcing the end user to be the interop layer. There are lots of problems in interop, right? There are all sorts of different problems you could go after. The primary problem that we're trying to go after in FDC3, in my opinion, the thing that gets me up in the morning about this is this forcing the end user to be the person that has to put everything together and make everything work, because it creates terrible UX, and I believe that it creates a huge opportunity cost. So opportunity cost for the end user, and it also creates opportunity cost for the application developers and for the people who own these platforms, because most of these, because all interop is possible today, right? You can create, everybody's got APIs, you can make stuff work, but every single time you have to do that today, it's a one-to-one negotiation between different development groups. And because of that cost, there's just a huge number of things that just never happened, because the cost of entry into that interop is just too high. So if you can create a standard way that applications, once put on a desktop, can just do reasonable interop with each other and do things that matter to the end user, then developers don't have to worry about negotiating with every single other group that they might want to interact with. They can just write to a standard and they're done. As somebody said at an event like in New York, which I thought was amazing, he said this, he said, it wasn't somebody I've really talked too much about FDC3. He was just demoing what they had done without my involvement at all, no coaching. He said, once you implement FDC3, the world is your oyster. And I thought that was very nice. So, we want this kind of world, which you have on mobile, which is that, I just get this intelligent suggestions about how I can go from a map to Uber or Lyft, and I can share something directly into, the communication channel of my choice. Like, those things just happen. On the desktop, it's not so great. I mean, even with the new stuff that's coming out, right? So this is PWA experience, which just landed in Windows 10 in Chrome 70. So this is a weird PWA that's like an English accents map. I don't know. It's just something I chose at random. And I'm trying to tweet this this video, right? And there's a little share thing that comes up, and it's pretty bad, right? It's obviously just showing me stuff that doesn't really relate to what I have available. It's just the stuff that they coded to in their app. And when I hit Twitter, it just opened like a regular Chrome pop-up window that has no relationship to the PWA, and gives me this really less than nice UX experience here. Like it kind of like PWA is creating this suspension of disbelief that you're running a native app, and then as soon as it pops up this ugly kind of unformatted like Chrome pop-up window to share my tweet, it like just breaks that suspension of disbelief. And if I close the PWA, the tweet doesn't know that. If I close the tweet, the PWA doesn't know that. Like there's just no orchestration layer at all, right? So we want to solve this problem, right? And I think I kind of went over, first mistake of the day. So this is why we're going after this in FDC3, create standards around these things. I just want to acknowledge for a moment all these organizations, and there are probably some missing, that are involved with FDC3. And it's quite a great list. If you are involved and you don't see your organization's logo here, please just let me know, and I apologize. And I also want to take a moment to thank everybody participates. Leslie and who else is here? Jorge, Kat, Colin, yeah, Rico, Espen, Johan. There's a lot, and there's many of you. Mao and everybody at FINOS has been supportive. In the past month or so, we've ratified all the initial 1.0 standards out of all the working groups. And that means we're going to enter into an exciting time when we can start to really go in and implement these things and then iterate on those implementations and see how these things really work in the wild. So this is what the working group structure looks like. For those of you who are not too familiar, there are essentially 4 technical working groups: context, data, intents, app directory, and API. And there's also a use cases working group that's headed up by Kat and Jorge, who drive a lot of it, along with Sayori Fotenos and JT, Jonathan Tepper from JP Morgan. So the idea here is that we have requirements drive the use cases working group that informs these other technical working groups. The API working group is really where we sort of we created a picture of how all these things would come together. And that boils down to standards that then organizations across finance will implement. And then everything will be just magical. So this is why looking back at web intents, you can kind of be like, oh, wow, this is really hard. A lot of really smart people have tried to solve this problem. And this is why I think that things are different this time. So the big one is timing, right? So as I pointed out before, web intents was very early. It was trying to do stuff where people didn't even really have the structures and the models there. So the underlying technology that this is resting on is a lot more mature today. And that's both the web technology and I would say the general open source technology. Not just the tooling around open source, but just the maturity we have around open source and being able to do things like FINOS. Like, could you imagine FINOS happening in 2010 or 2012? I mean, people weren't even using web technology in most of this industry. And we have, neutral brokers today, right? Which is really important. Neutral brokers like FINOS and like OpenFin that is providing a common base across the industry. And then also, we have really strong demand for this within a specific industry. And when Web Intents was first launched, it was kind of like, this is a really cool technical thing we can do, but there was there weren't real stakeholders in making that work, which is why they were mostly just doing, meme creators. The second thing is focus, right? So again, this goes back to having the industry specificity. Yeah, that's hard for me to say. So having the specifics of an industry set of use cases that keeps that sort of initial set of intents, the kinds of data structures we're going to have, the use cases we're going to want to support. It keeps us very focused on these things. And we have also, again, an ecosystem of stakeholders that really care about this stuff and have it's actually important for our business who want to build these things. And then finally, we have technology, right? We have so what's interesting is that this is kind of a mix of new and old here. So the app model that we are used to in finance actually solves the trust problems of the open web, right? So a lot of the problems that something like Web Intents faced was just that in the open web, in the consumer browser, you don't have the app install experience. And so making the orchestration work doesn't really make sense, and giving things greater access to what they can do on the desktop can't work. We have UX solutions not available in the browser. And we also have, we're creating a technology around the concept of federated directories that are going to replace this kind of broad discovery. So this is another thing. We're going back to like the intents tag of Google and wanting to index the web for intents tags. That's an interesting solution in the open consumer web, But that's not what people want in enterprise. In enterprise, organizations want to have their own app directories where they have all their internal apps coordinated, and then maybe they have some things that they bring in from third parties that they can onboard specifically. And maybe they have a vendor platform they're working with that provides its app directory, and those things can come together. But we're talking about sort of like archipelagos of walled gardens, right? That get interconnected in different ways, rather than just sort of the rough and tumble open world of the web where like everything's got to be just like wide open. And I think that you can foster a lot more within these kinds of like collections or clusters of app directories. So in FDC3, these things all come together into a concept that we call the desktop agent, which is really specifically meant to reference the user agent terminology that's meant to describe a browser. The idea here is the desktop agent is another layer that describes what back in the day we would have called a container, right? And this is where we get into the mix of old and new, right? So we're basically saying, hey, we want to redefine what the financial container looks like, and it's not, just something where like stuff runs inside of, but it has these other elements as well, and it's built on open standards, and it's built using like a kind of web-first technology. So the desktop agent serves as a launcher, renderer, and interop broker for apps, and it's basically, it has an app directory, it exposes FDC3 APIs to the apps that run inside of it, and it creates the routing of intents and context data between apps. It also provides all that UX orchestration. And you'll notice, so one of the points of this diagram is that all the things in white are the things we're standardizing in FDC3. The things in gray are things that are left to implementation. So if Refinitiv wants to build their specific flavor of this, not to call you guys out directly, but like, they have all the power in the world to like decide how their UX is going to work, what kind of capabilities they're going to expose to their apps, like how their apps are going to leverage all these things. They can compete on all those things. All that gets standardized are these basic interfaces between things so that we can all agree on some common like, touch points in the language. So this is trying to strike the balance between how organizations can build innovative technology that is their own special sauce, and how we can standardize on the things that really should be mutualized so we can have those common touch points. And this is kind of the model we're going after in FDC3. It's really driven by this trend that's been going on for a little while, which is this digital transformation of the financial desktop from a monolithic structure to something where it's separate apps that can be mixed in different ways that can give end users best of breed solutions and keep people from being locked in to these very kind of specific container solutions. Obviously, this is something that OpenFin has a lot of interest in. It's kind of what we do. It doesn't mean that we're the only desktop agent out there, but this is something that we have spent a lot of time focused on and thinking about, and it's one of the things that led us to start FDC3. So in the way that we're trying to envision this on our side of how we approach FDC3 is that what we're really building is a target to, last year we would have called it just a target for HTML5. This year it's a target for PWAs, how we think about it. So while Chrome keeps moving forward and it's solving some of these things with PWA, on the desktop you still need this industry-specific orchestration layer to create all the other things that you're not going to get in the commercial browser. And the other thing that we think is critical for doing some of these things that we're talking about at FDC3 and creating these kinds of standards is to have this kind of a common distribution, right? And today, OpenFin has got over 1,000 apps running on it. It's in over 1,500 banks and buy-side firms. It's deployed in over 60 countries, and we're approaching 200,000 desktops that we are within our ecosystem. So this is something that is puts us in a place to help really drive a lot of these standards. And we are working very closely with FINOS. This little Gab made me put this in, but no, but seriously, we're working very closely with FINOS to bring these things together in terms of balancing the standards across the industry with the various interests that all the organizations that are coming and contributing to this have. We do think that the future is bright and that OpenFin plus FDC3 plus FINOS creates kind of like a great trifecta, I think is the right word, is it? To provide governance and technical structure to solve these really very real problems of web intents that they were trying to address back in 2010, back in 2012, that we can now solve within our industry. And what we really want to do is transform this saddled desktop container into something that is as delightful as chocolate and peanut butter. And that is the talk. Thank you. And I can leave some time for questions if there are questions. Yeah, Leslie.
So we spent a lot of time talking about this in the working group, and clearly we think FDC3 and FINOS are fantastic, and we put Group 42 where you put OpenFin, which is a bit of plug I'm going to do. But actually, I think the trouble is you're too young to be making this talk. Because
wow, I'm flattered.
So being old has its disadvantages, but actually you have more history. So I mean, you call out this guy Paul. Actually, the first set of intents that I ever came across was in the very early 90s. Someone called Ian Koenig who worked at Reuters. And the RTW was all based on this idea of applications publish verbs. You right-click the thing, it's a noun. And so web intents was an attempt to do that in a container, but there have been many attempts to do it on the desktop.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So it's important, and therefore that's why I think a lot of the use cases already exist in the financial desktop, because we all saw it with Reuters in the 90s, and every application has right-click. Whatever I click depends on what I can get. And I think the interesting and the exciting thing about FDC3, as you say, is to try and make it open, and that you can automatically, you don't have to be an icon application, you don't have to be a Bloomberg application to get on that right-click. You can be any kind of application running in any container. So I think that's why maybe it's easier to solve than the web intents failures might suggest, because it's already been done multiple times in multiple terminals. What we're trying to do is get out of that. It's only within the context of a terminal.
I think that's an excellent point, and definitely I didn't mean to imply that the concept was invented by Google in 2010. It certainly goes way back, and actually my first encounter of it was in fact at Reuters, where I worked on 3000 Extra and did a lot in terms of the interoperability there. And so yeah, I mean it's absolutely true. And I think in finance we have this specific stake in this app-to-app communication. The stakes are quite a bit higher in our industry than it seems to be in many others, but I do suspect that there are many enterprises where this kind of app interoperability management is a really key thing. Any other questions? Yeah, Rika.
So I like that quote that you had about why web intents fail because of doing too many intents too quickly and too many different things and starting small, which I think is very important. But how do you balance starting small with just a few things with the demands of the industry that want to do this and that and the other? Like how do you go fast enough but not too fast?
That's a good question. I think the answer is just very carefully, and that's what we've been trying to do, right? As I'm sure you and many others here know, it's a constant balancing act between not getting too far ahead of ourselves in terms of where we can build consensus, but also the pressure to define things when we have, I mean, this is not greenfield. There are long existing systems that are running with many variations of these kinds of things today. So I think for me, the important thing is the distinction between that, FDC3, I think it's important to remember, isn't trying to be all-encompassing. So not just because something is not yet defined in FDC3 doesn't mean that you can't do it according to FDC3 opinion. It just means we haven't standardized it yet. So, so everyone should keep that in mind as they're looking at this, that we're just trying to find those critical touch points and prioritize them. Yes, I'm sorry, I think James, you had your hand up first maybe?
Yeah, and so if I've got multiple desktop can they speak to each other? So I can kind of like see a situation where I get some apps with OpenFin, I get some other apps that I've got internally developed, I've got multiple desktops. I mean, this is sort of the way things work, right, is you let up the lots.
Yeah. So So when we have multiple desktop agents or platforms, we call them, as we might call them, that's something that we are talking about within FDC3. We have not yet put forth the standard about it. We wanted to get the language, the basic like building blocks of the languages around context data intents, especially locked down first before we went to that. I think even just having those building blocks goes a long way in being able to have different platforms talk to each other, because now, like if I say to Icon, oh, I want to view a chart, it will actually understand what I'm asking for, and I won't have to know the specific Icon word for that, right? Now, there's a lot of interesting technical things to start working out around how platforms interconnect, right? Because most of them, I think a lot of them today are going to be using local WebSocket. So now we've got to like figure out how we do port discovery. And then you get into how do we, authenticate that or verify that this thing that says it's Autobahn is in fact Autobahn, right? So there are a number of like really deep issues to work through there. We're definitely interested in getting to that work of figuring that out, but a lot of it is just getting the right people to the table, come to the right agreements, and getting those platforms then to implement those standards, right? So John.
You talked about kind of solving the problem of having to do end integrations to talk to end platform.
Yeah.
How do you kind of prevent just moving that problem somewhere else? Say I want to send a trade to 3 different execution platforms. Do you force each one to speak the same language to understand what a trade means? And I mean, you can come up with as many examples.
Yeah.
Whatever use case you want.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So, yeah, are we just moving the problem from one place to another? And that's an age-old problem in trying to solve these things. Because I'm actually older than I look, Leslie. But the way I think about that is that if there is a recognized standard that can get a critical mass, then there will be an incentive for application providers and platform providers to start to build to that standard, because they will be able to create a better experience for their end users. And that point, it just becomes competition in the marketplace, right? So if you decide, you know what, I'm not going to bother, implementing this standard, and because I've got my own way of doing it, or because I don't think it's important, or whatever it is, and you force developers could still connect to your platform. They just have to use your system, right, to do so. You're not actually necessarily blocking anybody off. You're just people that have to continue what they do today, which is figure out what your APIs are and figure out when your APIs change, how they have to update their code, and go through that cycle constantly. So if you choose to do that, it may be fine, but it may be that eventually fewer platforms want to integrate with you, or fewer applications will want to, because it's a lot of work for them, and maybe there's a critical mass of others who are providing a great experience without them having to go through additional work. And I think it's going to take time for that to play out, but that's what I would hope would happen. Yeah.
Just add one comment. I mean,
Sure.
The desktop agent is not part of the FDC3 anything at the moment. It's an implementation strategy, and we're going to propose a different one that absolutely addresses the question they're talking about. But the great thing is the FDC3 thing, which we've been able to agree on all these things, provides a language and an API and a mechanism for having context that whatever your implementation years,
Yeah.
it all stays the same. So I think it's been a hugely important step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good distinction. There's a nuance, but yeah, the desktop agent is a concept. There's no desktop agent standard in FDC3.
And it's not required necessarily.
It's not required. It's mentioned as a concept in the API standard, but it's not like there's a requirement for it. Yeah. Sorry, is that time? Or was that okay? Yeah. So any other question? We're out of time, or we have?
Right on time.
We're right on time. And he's, yeah. Yeah, you can just come and bother me after. Thank you.